So I'm Steve Cerisi, current president of NCME, and they said we weren't going to have a conference, but obviously we are. So I'd like to welcome you all to the 2020 NCME conference and just thank everybody participating in this session for making it happen. Dr. Edmund Gordon, who had the idea for the session today, has been constantly pushing the measurement community and NCME to put the E back in NCME and to really think about how educational assessment can be used to facilitate education. So with Edmund, we put together just a great panel today. My colleague, Jennifer Randall, is going to facilitate that panel. So I'll turn things over to Jennifer in a minute, and then I'll come back at the end just to remind everybody about the NCME business meeting on Monday at 12:30. I'm going to ask everybody who's not a panelist to please mute yourself if you accidentally get off mute, and enjoy the session. Jennifer, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone to Using Educational Assessments to Educate, a conversation with Edmund Gordon. So this session talks about, well, if learners vary in their cultural experiences, appreciations, characteristics, and needs, all aspects of culturally relevant pedagogy may need to reflect these variations. However, educational assessments have been most resistant. This session will examine the pros and the cons of repurposing of educational assessment in the service of teaching and learning when learners differ. In this session, Dr. Edmund Gordon will give a brief overview of his current thoughts regarding how educational assessments can better be used to improve education for all students. Our invited panel is going to provide some brief reactions to Dr. Gordon's remarks, followed by a facilitated question and answer session from the audience. The audience is, of course, encouraged to engage in the discussion by asking questions or providing their own remarks. At any time, if you have a question, please feel free to enter that question into the chat feature of Zoom, or simply raise your hand so that you'll be called on. Also, panelists, don't forget to raise your hand and jump right in at any time during the discussion. I know it can be awkward on Zoom when we can't see your faces. Remember, I can't see your faces, all of you. Zoom shows me random faces. First, I want to introduce our presenters. First, we have Dr. Lloyd Bond. So Dr. Bond, wave your hand. Dr. Bond is a retired senior scholar with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. He obtained his PhD in 1976 from Johns Hopkins University, specializing in psychometrics. He has taught at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He has published widely in the areas of assessment, measurement theory, and testing policy, and has made fundamental contributions to the measurement of teaching performance and to the literature on measures of quantitative reasoning. We also have Dr. Kristen DeCerbo. Kristen, raise your hand. She's the Vice President of Learning Research and Design at Pearson, where she leads a team embedding what we know from learning and assessment research into digital learning experiences. Her personal research agenda has focused for years on simulation and game-based formative assessment. She's particularly interested in how the digital world impacts teaching and learning. And of course, we have Dr. Kina Arbuthnot. Raise your hand or say hello. Who is the Associate Vice President of Research and Economic Development and the Joan Pender Magnus Distinguished Professor of Education at Louisiana State University. She has a PhD in educational psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, specializing in psychometrics, applied statistics, and program evaluation. Began her career as a lecturer on education and a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, and has published a host of articles and publications, as well as 2 books, Filling in the Blanks, Understanding the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Global Perspectives on Educational Testing, Examining Fairness, High-Stakes Tests, and Policy Reform. And our last panelist is Dr. Richard Durand, professor in the Gervitz Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His expertise is in the assessment of multilingual learners. He also conducts research on learning interventions, incorporating formative assessment and student engagement from sociocultural and socio-cognitive approaches. And of course, we have our featured speaker, Dr. Edmund W. Gordon, who is John M. Munster Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Yale University and the Richard March Ho Professor of Psychology and Education Emeritus at Teachers College, Columbia University. He is a member of both the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Gordon convened and served as chairperson of the Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment in Education. He has authored or edited 20 books and over 250 book chapters and journal articles. So at this time, again, I am going to turn this over first to Dr. Gordon to provide his remarks. And then again, as individuals have questions, please enter those questions into the chat and I will facilitate getting those to the panelists. Dr. Gordon.
I didn't grow up being a psychometrician. I've kind of come to this area recently. Although I've been thinking lately about my experience 65 or more years ago, back in the mid-50s. I had the privilege of working with a special education teacher. I was supposed to be tutoring her in measurement, but it ends up that she really taught me the meaning of educational assessment. Her name was Elsa Hoiseman. And Elsa had the notion that it was her job as teacher of kids with special challenges to understand not what they knew, but what they were learning, and even more important, what they were not learning and why. She developed a extensive procedure for the documentation of the teaching and learning processes in these kids. She would write pages and pages and pages of commentary, of report. Then she would hand these to teachers with fairly detailed descriptions of what these findings meant, what her observations meant for the actual instruction of kids. She felt that it was her job to enable these learners to use whatever resources they had to learn. Now, those of us who have been in measurement for a while know that we have kind of prided ourselves on our capacity to measure, to document what I call developed ability. The mainstream of our field has not concerned itself a great deal with learning. An old friend of mine told me last night, Eva Baker, that back in 1970, a friend of mine, Clifford Hill, had written a little essay on assessment in the service of learning. When I was privileged to serve as chairperson of the Commission on the Future of Assessment, Cliff did another version of that paper for me. He got ill before he could finish, so he never finished. But I kind of have taken on as my task of my final years to try to write what I thought he was trying to tell us. And I think he was on the same page with Elsa, my special education teacher. He was trying to encourage us to repurpose educational assessment, not to back away from measurement, not to give up on measurement, but to give equal attention to learning that we have given to the measurement of behavior. And to do that, we've got to do some different things. It seems to me that what we do in measurement can inform, can guide, can actually educate. Our task right now is to figure out how we do it. Louis Gomez, in criticizing the work of the Commission, says Gordon has come up with a good vision, maybe even a North Star. What we need now is a blueprint. I suppose today we're even asking the question, can it be done? And if so, how? I'm through.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gordon. Dr. Bond, did you have something? Did you want to respond?
Well, there's one point that I wanted to make early on. Dr. Gordon's concern is primarily with the students, but I think we could also repurpose measurement for teachers. My first stat course was, I had a really remarkable instructor. He started the course out by asking us of the 3 local grocery stores in this little town, who has the lowest prices? And he assigned us to teams of 4 each. And we struggled mightily with it. We did awful things. We said, all right, you take aisle 1, 2, and 3. I'll take aisle 3, 4, and 5, and so on. And we got very frustrated after about the 3rd day, because we realized that a census of every item in the store was ridiculous. We had no idea of how to conduct a random sample. He took our awful responses, put them away, and then at the end of the course, he gave us that same question again: who has the lowest prices? And the difference in quality of the responses was just fabulous, was incredible. He used assessment to assess his own teaching rather than our learning. And that's an aspect of Dr. Gordon's vision that I think has been overlooked. So I'd like to get someone's response to that notion.
Tina, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so Dr. Gordon and I have talked about this on several occasions in terms of repurposing assessments. And I think part of the challenge for me is that I don't think that assessments need to necessarily be repurposed. I think we can serve multiple purposes, as Dr. Bond talked about teachers, and a lot of the Gordon Commission respondents a couple years ago talked about the feedback loop and the need for assessments to be more responsive and very much more quick. But I also think that there's a space there where Dr. Gordon is saying, I believe, and I challenge him on this, is saying that we need to move away from measuring ability. And I think I've said this in other forums, is that we can't move away from that. I think if you're coming from a teacher perspective, even from a policymaker perspective, I think that there is a need for us to know students' abilities at this point in time or at this juncture. So I think moving away from that would be irresponsible of us. But I also believe that this vision of a new purpose or multiple purposes of assessment and really focusing in on cultivating, as you said, cultivating learning and understanding learners. I think especially in this new world that we're living in right now, I think it is definitely the direction we need to be going. But I just want to be clear that as we move in that direction, that we won't throw out the notion that we need to know where students are. I think when we're talking about special education, we're talking about gifted education, we're talking about just even training teachers and teachers understanding ability. I think we have to be clear and ensure that we understand where students are at any given point in time. Now, the way in which we do that, we can do that in multiple ways and think about that, but I think we don't want to move away from that totally without understanding where students are at this point in time or this juncture, knowing what students know at this point.
Yeah. You like to remind us of the importance of measurement. I don't want my position to get interpreted as being anti-measurement. I probably don't respect my traditional approaches to measurement as much as you do, but I certainly am not against it. Even if I were, I learned from our friend Bob Mislevy when we first started the commission. I was a bit more anti-measurement, considerably more anti-measurement than I am now. And Bob was suggesting to me that I might get further embracing measurement and trying to extend its boundaries than I would get challenging it. And he's absolutely right. I think your field's got 100, maybe 300-year history. And in education, some of our strongest scholars have come from measurement. So it's not quite smart for me to tackle the validity of your existence. But I do say that I think that the brilliance that you measurement people have brought to education can also be used to help us educators teach, as well as giving us more definitive information about the status of our learners. I'm not sure that we need it. When I was in the classroom, I had a reasonably good understanding of who was getting it and who was not, and who was the smartest and who was the slowest. What I needed help with was moving these people along, helping them do what they were becoming, helping them to learn more efficiently, or to correct the things that were standing in the way of their learning. So let's you and me not debate about whether we ought to excommunicate assessment. Let's keep it at the table.
Great idea.
Richard, I'd like to pose a question to you, Richard Durand, question that we had before, and I think is related to this notion of measurement and assessment and the purposes. Are the development and the measurement purposes of assessment incompatible? So where do you stand there?
Well, okay, let's, thanks for having me here. And I remember when I first started my program in mathematical psychology at UC Berkeley, that the issue of what it meant to understand what measurement was about was not just psychometrics. What measurement included was the ability to be able to take formal systems and map out their progression and changes over variables in ways that were more open. So one issue to consider is that perhaps our starting point should not be to only consider repurposing measurement as we know it and as useful as it is, and we want to continue that, but to also consider additional notions of measurement and assessment that might apply to empirically grounded understandings and evidence that of what learners can do and what it means for them to learn, but more importantly, to be educated. And Ed has issues, this notion of becomings, of learners becoming who they are in the settings that they're learning. And what I'd like to propose is that we consider also expanding our notions of assessment and measurement to include even qualitative logical analysis of how learning tasks are accomplished in situ, involving collaborations between learners with each other, learners and instructors, and learners and other resources. So for me, one direction, not the only direction, of course, for classroom assessments is to be able to think about the design of instruction and the conceptual models that underlie accomplishments of tasks for persons in a class, learners in a classroom, so that they're making meaning. And that meaning, I think consistent with what I've heard Kina's speak about, it's more about being a person in a setting and having an identity and background that's activated in the process of gaining information about knowledge and skills. So one of the tensions and issues we face is kind of being able to think about, as Lloyd was saying, the interaction between teachers and learners, what teachers know about learners, what learners understand about tasks, what assessment developers have in mind in the design of tasks given the institutional policy objectives. And so this matrix of different perspectives is all implicated, but I'm personally very interested in this dynamic, animated interaction between learners and teachers in classrooms, and how the very interactions themselves constitute forms of assessment. Conditional reactions on how to take up what you're doing on task, how you're progressing on it, how to think about it, given feedback from teachers. And those processes of interaction themselves contain information that is valuable from an assessment perspective, although it might not turn out to be the psychometrics that we use most in our large-scale assessment, RRT-based. It might come out as simulations. It might come out as conditional training designs. It might come out as clinical interactions between a teacher and students, and they provide information about how students perceive tasks, how they're doing it, and how they're going with regard to progress on goals. So that's to start us out.
Thank you, Richard. A couple of housekeeping things I want to point out. One, this session is being recorded and will be made available to the entire NCME community. And also, if you want to speak, when I said raise your hand, I didn't mean actually raise your hand because I can't see, I can only see 2 or 3 of you at the time. If you go into the participants, select participants, there's a place in there for you to click on raise hand. And if you do that, then I'll see your hand go up. For example, right now I see Kristen's hand has gone up. So Kristen, you'd like to respond?
Thank you. So just a couple of thoughts there of things that I've heard, thinking about how the teacher and the student are working together in the classroom. And as I think about us as a community of measurement people at NCME, I think if we think this is a worthwhile endeavor to bring this idea of measurement and learning together, I would caution us not to try to do this on our own. In fact, we need to think about that as a partnership and understand from the educators what are their pain points and what do they want out of measurement and the community. And about 3 years ago, I think it was 2017, there was an NCME classroom assessment conference that got kicked off. And the first panel was Margaret Heritage and Neil Kingston. And Dr. Heritage, of course, is an expert in that classroom assessment world, and Dr. Kingston, of course, is all of the more standardized summative assessment. And even in the conversation, you could tell there's just different vocabulary and different values and different ways of thinking about this problem. And so if we talk about what does a blueprint look like for this, I think one of the first steps is actually bringing together communities to help understand each other and where we fall and establish some common ground.
Actually, Kristen, that process might better be, I'm trying to find a word for it, concert. It sounded like instead of turning to one or the other of us, we turn to the 2 of us, the group of us, to try to understand this thing we're doing, or the thing that the learner is trying to do, or the things that learners and teaching persons are trying to do. Maybe our decontextualization, which we have turned to in measurement for greater precision and validity, may actually be losing the thing that we most need from our analysis of the teaching and learning situation.
Richard.
Thank you. Yes, and so, but before we want to kind of make this into a binary decision, we think of it also as a possibility of coexistence of different perspectives that are complementary. I think that's what I was gathering from Kristen's comment. But there may be also a breaking point with regard to what we can expect from psychometrics that is associated with the clinical relationship, the professional relationship, and the interpersonal relationship between learners and teachers in classrooms, which is a socio-emotional and cultural dimension that in principle, it may not be standardizable, but yet may be very critical. And so it raises the possibility that coming back to what Lloyd was saying, of teachers' conceptual models of learners and understanding within practical terms of how instruction is going and feedback provided students and the reaction to it. But from learners' perspective, it might represent another perspective, and from a large-scale measurement perspective, the information obtained by clinical judgment may be considered unreliable, not unreplicable, but it may make sense in context. But yet, the information that's provided by the large-scale assessment, or versions of it, or diagnostic assessments, or interim assessments in large-scale state assessment terms, might provides information that's useful, but then the regime or the design of how to take advantage of that information then becomes a complex problem in itself.
I resonated to what I heard as it may not be standardizable, and I resonated to it because about 3 months before Elsa Horseman, my special education teacher, before she died, a friend of mine and I were with her because she was always criticizing herself because she couldn't standardize what she was doing. And Herb and I were trying to tell her that what she was doing didn't need to be standardizable. Maybe what the field needed was her non-standardized version.
Lloyd, I know you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I was trying to, I was responding to what Ed said about all we have are the results, the black and ovals. We don't know how the students came to those answers. One of the great faults of multiple choice tests is that all we have is just a string of ones and zeros. We don't have it. So we've standardized how to get those ones and zeros, but we don't really understand them. One of my challenges as an instructor was I can understand what an 800 on the SAT means. What I don't know is what a 500 means. What knowledge do they really have, and what knowledge do they lack that they ended up with a 500? And trying to understand that, I think, is one huge challenge, and it's foursquare within what Ed is talking about, trying to understand not just the final score, but how the kid got there, what he knows and what he does not know. I'll have more to say about it.
I think that's something that I see. There was a question in the chat actually about process data. And a lot of the work that I have done is this idea of, now that we live in this digital environment, can we use process data to help understand and see what it is that, how did the students get to that final place, and where is that, and how do they do that? And I think that's an emerging field still. I would not say that we've figured all of that out, and how to interpret all of that data. And it seems like this, in my opinion, it seems like there's still a lot of noise to the signal that we're looking for in all of that data that we get if we actually track students as they interact in a digital environment, and where that is. I think it's an interesting path to think about. Is that one way we could get to that idea of how students got to their answer and what methods they use? But then on the other hand, there's also this issue that I've run into, that there's so much that we actually don't see there. So if two students are working together on a digital problem, we don't capture any of their interaction of how they ended up getting to that solution and where things are as well, which then gets, I think, back to Richard's point about thinking about, you know, what are the important things, what should be standardized, and what maybe, are we okay if it's not standardized, and how do those fit together?
Since you raised that set of issues, let me ask you a question that I struggle with. I think I want to embrace what my students tell me is dialogic assessment. And I think that term is used to talk about assessments that grow out of dialogue, where the person being assessed has an opportunity to both answer and ask questions and explain herself. Is that what you're trying to get on top of in your process analysis, or is it something more than that?
So that's one option that I haven't, my work is not as much in that answer, but even just asking the students, why do you think that's the answer, and analyzing that can be a really powerful assessment tool. The other things that I've done are, for instance, in a game, when we're, for instance, trying to assess systems thinking, we can watch all of the ways that students interact in the system of the game and figure out if they understand, based on what they do in the game. We see not just their final answer, not just their ones and zeros, but how did they get to that that response in the game? What were all of the actions that they took? And we try to make inferences from those actions about what they understand about the problem solving itself, not just what their final answer is. And so again, we've had moderate success doing that, but it's the same idea of trying to get at the, not just what the student's final answer is, but what their process is to get there and why they think that that's the important place.
Richard, you had something to add?
Yes, thank you. What I think what this begs is having an understanding of what learning tasks are about, a conceptual problem-solving model of learning tasks, so as that you can do, as Mark Wilson has suggested, you can identify impasses or points, a partial order of things that need to be done in order to be successful in completing a task. And there may be more than one way to complete a task to master a particular skill or a domain. But what one would need would be a model of the task that would allow tracking of the process against the model, so that it would be possible to hypothesize where a student might be at in terms of their necessary steps, phases that they would have to complete successfully with, and possibly with feedback, in the performance of a task, and then build a measurement model on top of that. That's an approach that is done in sociocognitive assessment, as well as in diagnostic assessments and approaches like that are done in the field of psychometrics, but it requires that understanding. And then keeping in mind, as George Box would say, every model is wrong and doesn't fit. Of that too. So, you have to be able to appreciate that there's more than one way of understanding process data. And there's also the possibility that raw process data in and of itself, explored inductively by data analytic methods, might identify patterns in timing or in responses that uncover processing that was not in the model that was designed for the task, and that leads to the identification of a different kind of conceptual model to track progress.
I think this also, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think as we talk about process data and how important it is, and I definitely agree with Kristen and Richard that information is important, but some of the research I've done looking at cultural differences shows that how we get that data and where we get that data is really important. So when Kristen said game, And if that's considered more low contact, more low stakes, then that's fine. But if we're considering saying that we're going to do this in a high stakes situation or in a situation where there's accountability measures linked to it, then we still have to raise the question of how are these environments impacting students differentially? And so we come back to the same issues that we have with multiple choice items with, whereas, if it's a high stakes accountability situation or a situation that can dictate how they move forward in school, et cetera, then we may see students, depending on the environment, change the way they process items. So the research that I've done states that, for example, minority students and women, when they're put in certain environments, they change the way in which they process items. So if that's the case, then as we look at this data, it may just be a function of their environment. So where one student may show us how guesstimate to get to an answer, and another student goes through kind of this very long, rigorous process to solve a, let's just say, mathematics item, we may make conclusions about these students based on the environment they're in and not necessarily based on what they know. So I think some of Dr. Gordon's challenges to us is not necessary, is more than just saying, how do they process it? Can we capture that? But I think it's more forward thinking is, what do we do with this data once we have it about what they know and how they know it and how in which they process it? And then how do we move forward to build this person and help to cultivate them from where they are? But I think really some of the issue potentially when we're talking about diverse groups of students is, how can we capture that, and how does environment, stereotypes, threat, and everything else kind of overlap with this and help us to inform how we would move forward? And that means that we would have to be willing to be more agile in the way in which we get the data. Does that make sense? I think it's important to understand process. I'm behind that, but I also think that we have to be careful about saying that if we know more about how they process X, Y, and Z, then we can help them move forward. But maybe we're missing something there. And as psychometricians, it's really hard to say that, the way one person processes in one environment may be very different in the way that they process outside of that environment.
Kina, were you saying that women and minorities process data information differently from white men? Or is it that white men, women, and Black men process data differently?
So the research I showed was basically, I took a lot of the gender research that was out there, and then I started doing research with minorities, comparing minorities with majorities. But what I found in the area of just mathematics, let me give that caveat, in just mathematics, that women actually mirror what African-American test takers look in the testing situation. So they become very conservative in the way in which they process test items, where white men tend to be much more liberal in terms of the strategy choices that they use, which would basically say that if we were to look at kind of the way in which students process items, depending on the environment, there may be a minority versus majority and a gender issue that we have to contend with in understanding that data.
Thank you.
Kristen, did I see your hand up?
Yes, although I will admit I didn't lower it after the last time, but actually, but yeah, I actually agree with all of that. So first, I think all of this like simulation in games where we're talking about process data is not in any way ready for high stakes assessment with, serious consequences. And, we want to be thinking about how can we use it in the other kinds of situations. But just a quick concrete example, I was part of a team that worked on this project called SimCity EDU. And we tried to get, if you're familiar with SimCity, you're in the middle of this simulated city. We created one and asked students to reduce air pollution in it. And there were lots of different things about the system that you could tweak to make that happen. However, we had a small group of students who just bulldozed the entire city. And guess what? That really lowers the air pollution too. But how do you interpret that as make inference about a student based on they just bulldozed the whole thing? So again, when we're talking about this process data, students are going to do things you don't expect, and we need to think about what does that mean for the inferences that we're going to make about what they know and what they can do. And we have to be really careful about what that is. Is that creativity? Is that, you know, what are the things that we want to make inferences about, and what should we be making inferences about when we start looking at these new kinds of information?
Well, Kristen, that actually is a wonderful segue into a question asked by Milena. She asked the panel, where does the student and student self-advocacy for interpretation of their own results fit into these models and their role of co-producers and co-interpreters of the data? Does anyone on the panel want to take a shot at that?
Could you restate that again?
Yes, absolutely. And Milena, it'd be great if you could just post that to everyone too, so they'll have it as a record. Where does the student and student self-advocacy for interpretation of their own results fit into these models in their role of co-producers and co-interpreters of the data? So kind of what's the role of the student's input and advocacy as we interpret these results?
One place where it's not quite student advocacy, but where we've started to do this is when we do think alouds, or in the game world actually has a tradition of play testing where you actually have the students say what they're doing and follow up often with, hey, why did you do that? And you can do that with a game, you can do it with a traditional assessment of, you know, as you're starting to design these activities or tasks, asking the students themselves based on, you know, you're observing what they're doing, and then you are asking them to explain why they're doing that to help you get to that sense of what they understand. But I think the next step, and maybe what the question is really about, are there then things, you know, after a student actually takes the assessment itself, instead of just in the development stages, where we could bring learners into interpreting their own data? I think that's an interesting possibility.
Yeah. Richard, I know you had some thoughts.
Yes, I think where's the learner in this? This is a very, very, very critical, essential question. I mean, but there are many purposes for assessment, and they all incorporate issues of effects on learners in one form or another, high stakes or not. But the learner's perspectives are really almost hidden, totally hidden in all these concerns, and I think it's something to worry about. Now, the question rose in the chat room about formative assessment and process data. One of the areas that I've worked in with Allison Bailey has been in looking at the interaction among students as they're working on tasks with teachers' input, but then looking almost like not a cognitive lab, but that same interaction that students are doing as they're pursuing tasks, talking about what they're doing and what they have to do next, that the linguistic data itself and the interaction data can be analyzed at a micro level with a lot of effort that may not make it very productive for mass scale concerns, but which could be very vital in the context of a classroom with particular kids who have particular dispositions, ways of doing things. Understanding how they react is very important. There's another dimension that's in here that's very powerful and very challenging to capture, and that's the issue of the motivation or socio-emotional involvement. Now, when we've looked at interaction data, what we find are the animation that's involved, the back and forth style of interaction between learners with each other. It doesn't necessarily resemble a pedantic pedagogical kind of lesson, broadcast lesson. What it resembles is casual talk about hard things, about hard work that's being done. And the way that students interact with each other is very interesting to analyze in depth, because then you see what they're paying attention to and not paying attention to, and you see how students react to each other, and then with input from a teacher, how they react to the teacher's input, all this requires metacognition. And arguably from a discourse analysis point of view, there is a notion of assessment that's there. Before I say something, I have to take up what you've told me and what I want to tell you back that will get us through this task sooner. So worrying about those condition action relationships and interaction is very powerful, but it's something that's non-deterministic. It can't be predicted completely ahead of hand. It emerges as part of the interaction.
Lloyd, did you have something to?
Well, it's I think my concerns have been answered, so I'll just bring up another point that's been in the back of my mind. Back at the University of Pittsburgh, I became interested in, this is back in the 70s, in the achievement gap, especially in quantitative reasoning. And I identified quite a few students, predominantly African-American students, but white students as well, who performed well in their math sequence in high school, got A's and B's in Algebra 1 and 2 and geometry, but did miserably on the SAT. And that intrigued me. And what I found out was, well, I gave them a straight declarative knowledge test of the facts of algebra and the facts of geometry. Like, you know, there are 360 degrees in a circle, 180 in a triangle, and just, you know, rules about how you handle exponents and parentheses in algebra. And they did really well. I mean, the mean score was something like 26 out of 30 of just their straight knowledge. But they had acquired these things in a list fashion. They were unconnected, inert, unusable. And so when I would ask them, when I would present them with a simple problem that required making connections between these things, they were at a complete loss. And it was especially so among African American students. They knew all of the facts of geometry, but they were in the long term, they had acquired them in such a way that they were essentially inert. They couldn't use them. And I think this process that Christian is talking about may elucidate some of the reasons for that.
Well, Kina, Dr. Arbuthnot, we can't say achievement gap and not at least have you speak to that.
Dr. Bond speaks to an issue that goes back to the cultural differences, and it goes back to some of the work that Stafford Hood and other folks have done in culturally responsive assessment. And one of the issues is that students, particularly African-American students, and when we're talking about in mathematics, we're talking about females as well, is typically what they typically do when asked to solve a problem in the face of any type of assessment is to be very conservative and to solve it the way in which their teacher told them to solve it, right? But that does not negate the fact that they can do it in other ways. And I think sometimes what happens culturally is I'm supposed to stay within the lines and do the rules. And some of the backstory to that is when we look at the data in terms of cultural differences across countries, the same thing comes about. I think someone in the chat was talking about students in Saudi Arabia versus, you know, the gender gaps there. What we see is they flip-flop depending on the type of environment it is. So in the States, typically a lot of the multiple choice items that we see the largest differences on, particularly that favor white students or male students, are those items that require you to think outside the box and maybe approximate or do, I'm speaking in mathematics. And what happens is that's different than what typically you're taught in the classroom, which is some of my argument about what are we valuing when we're making these assessments, because the assessments are sometimes consistent with people's culture and sometimes they're inconsistent with people's culture. And so as we start to think about that and we see where it overlaps, where it's consistent, then we see the people that the people or groups of students, cultural groups of students that are doing well are those that it's consistent with. So if, for example, if you give an algebra test, just like the one you gave in the classroom, what we see is differentially girls and minorities will do better controlling for achievement, right? But if you were to put in front of them items that will require them to connect things that have not necessarily been taught but are required of them, then you'll see other groups performing well, which are the white males. So ultimately, I think the question is, how does culture impact the way in which we, how does your culture impact the way in which you process items or you think about things? If I'm taught in a certain way, if we think about religion, we talk about the cultures of different countries. We have countries like in the Middle East or countries in Mexico or anything. Those types of countries that have what we call a high context culture, you find that those students do very formulaic, like algebra, they do very well when there are steps to be followed, right? But then you have cultures like Germany, a country like Germany, and basically the United States, when we're talking about the majority culture, you have those types of groups that do much better with those questions or items in mathematics that require you to think outside the box. Does that mean that the other groups can't think outside the box? Absolutely not. And the research shows that. It's saying that when put in these certain types of environments or situations, they revert back to what's comfortable to them culturally. And I mean, I know that's a lot, but it's basically saying that we have to take that into account when we're thinking about the way in which students process or even look at and conceptualize test items. But I'm going to raise a question to Dr. Gordon. I appreciate the conversation about, understanding processing, but I think in this form, I want to ask Dr. Gordon, what is your vision? Like, what do you mean in terms of cultivating learning? Is it about understanding how students process, or is it much more understanding how we can help any student at any place move forward? And I want to understand your thoughts on that. Jennifer, if you don't mind me asking the question.
No, of course, have at it. Yeah.
Maybe I mind you're asking the question. I've got to figure an answer to it. You're asking whether I want to make it a contextual, a cultural.
Well,
just pose your question. A question again for me.
I go back to your idea of like this forward thinking about cultivating learning. And I think that you and I, I'm right here in the weeds with how we're doing it right now, but you're saying, but no, how do we cultivate a student to learn regardless of who they are and using assessment to help move forward? And I think it goes back to the question of what's the blueprint? And I still grapple with that. And I think you know that. But I want to know what your vision is about what that blueprint could potentially look like.
Let me respond through Elsa Horseman's voice. She was my special ed teacher. 65 years ago, she was talking about the importance of context. And she thought that if one were thinking about documenting the learning situations or documenting the assessment situation, if you didn't know what the circumstances the respondent was referring to, you didn't have enough information to make a correct judgment about the learner's response. I think she would argue that if we get it right, we would understand any learner. The task would be to come up with strategies, approaches to assessing that would capture what each learner uniquely brings to the learning situation and the way in which she takes it out of it. I don't think it would be specific to a single culture, but I suspect it would have to be, I'm struggling between multicultural or a culture. It may be that it is not so much a part of the culture that the learner is familiar with, as it is a function of the match between whatever that culture provides and the learner's need for solving the problem. It's kind of a much more fluid situation. She wanted a procedure that didn't let me come out of that situation without your knowing what I was bringing to it, and even more important, how I used what I brought for that. I'm not sure whether I'm on your page or not. Tina?
Yes. No, great. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Richard, you wanted to respond to that directly.
Sure. Yes. And so, just following up on this thread, so what it begs is understanding, if we had a better understanding of what a student knows about a particular task and how they're approaching it, and we have a teacher's understanding of the purpose for the task in terms of a learning objective and evidence that would need to be shown about attaining that learning objective to various degrees, then what is created is an interesting new problem. How do we connect what a student can already do with what might be expected of a student? So now we start going into Ed's discussion of these dynamic tensions and dynamic assessment and formative assessment, areas where we try to understand better how to see what a student can do given a sufficient prompting and activation of attention, given what they can already do to what would be considered a closer approach to what's expected. And I think that's a very important kind of dynamic assessment principle that shows up in a lot of different ways. It will show up in games. It will show up in training simulations. It requires conditional reaction of a system that's monitoring learning to be able to gauge progress towards goal in some way, because it's designed by the system to do that kind of evaluation. And it may not come out as a matter of how a numerical ordinal relationship among scores. It's what's the meaning of the score in terms of progress on the task, in terms of a more developed, elaborated version of what is it, how does acquisition of the task happen given where students are at? How do we know that there's progression in developing competence as a result of students' response to feedback?
Richard, I had a buddy who unfortunately is dead, Herb Birch. Herb used to talk about conditional correlates between phenomena and the perceptions of persons. And he would almost argue that our concern with right answers may be missing the boat. It may be that what I ought to be looking for is what makes sense to Richard in this particular situation. Now that introduces the whole issue of relativity and conditional responses. But I'm going to go astray for just a second to illustrate what I'm talking about. Some of you know I have the Christian ministry in my background. One of the people who influenced me was a chap named Howard Thurman. Howard was an African-American theologian, and he talked about the belief systems of many Christian practitioners. And he was one day talking about the fact that for their purposes, the belief didn't have to be right or wrong. It had to serve their purposes. Now, is it possible that in the academic domain, the learning domain, my capacity to discern a relationship between two or three things may be more important than my capacity to discern the standard relationship. Also would have us accept, give credit for, accommodate the meaning that the learner brought to, or even more important, the meaning that she takes away from it, even if that meaning is counterintuitive, or even if it is considered wrong. Does that take us too far away for psychometrics? You certainly couldn't do a standardized test in that form. But I also would say if the youngster can move on from that point, isn't it more important to honor that movement and backfill than to stop the learning to correct?
Dr. Bond, you had something to say to that?
I do very much resonate, Ed, to the notion that not only should we measure in a summative fashion the right answer, but assess also the quality of one's reasoning in getting the wrong answer.
Right.
I think that's a very powerful thing that's sort of been overlooked. That we should try to understand better the learner's reasoning rather than the final outcome. That's my only point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So a question was posed to the panel. I'm going to just put it out to all of you. But there's been a lot of talk about cultural experiences in terms of race and ethnicity and gender. They'd like to know if you would talk a little bit more about cultural differences that result from socioeconomic factors, like students that come from lower income families, families living in extreme poverty, students that come from unstable, stressful home environments. Dr. Bond, your hand went up first.
My favorite and very short response to that question is this geography class where the teacher asked, "Where is Chile?" And the kid said, "In the cupboard." Every answer must be taken contextually, and it speaks directly to SES and to where the learner is coming from. That's my only point.
Richard, Dr. Durand.
Yeah, sure. Just to follow up a little bit more, continuing this humorous vein a bit. You know, I think that the input from students is you know, very challenging to understand when the response is based on their cultural background and other background characteristics. They're making sense of things. First of all, they understand that they have to respond, and so they're giving a response. The take up of that response against the standards that are being used for criterion performance in large scale assessments is virtually missing, because there's a time lag between, and you never find out what your response was, correct or not, to a given answer typically. But so the feedback is needed, but what's missing is kind of the allowance for a learner to say, "This is why I think this is so. I have something to contribute. Take it up and tell me why you think I'm not on target." So we miss that reciprocal interactive relationship that occurs in learning settings, where we have, if it's done well, feedback going back and forth all the time. And the testing situation and assessment situations are typically artifactually constructed. They're not the same as the instructional process. They're not the same thing as being a member of a classroom on a given day that's carrying out business as usual in terms of carrying out the instruction. Instead, the assessments tend to be isolated as separate events that decontextualizes their meaning in a way that the word that comes up is not a good word, but I'll use it, that cripples or limits the learner's capacity to respond because they're only allowed or expected to respond in certain ways, and any other way of responding that begins to build a bridge that's too far removed from what's at hand from the assessment designer and the assessment administration makes it impossible for that input to be had. So it's, in a way, it's shutting down the learner in terms of their capacity to interact. And there's also embedded in here system power relations, the accountability system and the other policy systems that are impacting on classrooms that come right down into the very use of assessments and their purposes, and where the students are not they're participants, but they're not generators of the understanding and knowledge that's associated with what they're being asked to learn typically.
So we have another question from someone in the audience to Ed's and Richard's points here. Is there a place for assessment to be used to make judgments about the moves that learners make to develop their own minds in the company of others? For example, to give an example for you here, can assessment be used to gain insight into how the learner engages socially, to assess the mental states of others as means to expand their thinking? What do these moves reveal about self-determination, self-organization, socio-emotional capacities that enable higher forms of thinking?
I don't know whether anybody is familiar with Lauren Resnick and Cherise Clark, I think it is. I think they call it, I'll describe it since I can't think of the name of it. It is responsible talk. They use interactions, assessment situations, or teaching and learning situations in which each participant is required to defend what one brings. Would that not be a teaching, learning, and assessment context in which each learner would be afforded the opportunity to defend, to support her position? It doesn't seem to me, though, to get away from a problem I don't have an answer to, and that is, in a technologically advanced society, if one is trying to enable people to prepare for participation in it, there appear to be limits to what can be accepted as rational. So isn't there a point at which we've got to impose the dominant or the accepted cultural form in order for societies to work? So I'm really raising two kinds of issues. One, is there not a limit to how much we can accommodate the cultural or personal variation that I bring? And the other piece is, are there not instructional circumstances in which I'm required to support or defend my position? I guess it's always within the context of certain limits that may be imposed by the hegemonic.
Richard?
Yeah, sure. Just one response to that is looking at what's going on now. The answer is, the accountability system and school system design imposes restrictions on how schools function that for some of us severely shut down what learning can be about. But learning happens. Learning happens outside of the scope of what is intended as a learning in classrooms. If you really follow what students do and talk about, they're learning and doing things and talking with each other and constructing notions of reality that that are not completely under the control of instructors. So there's that. There's also the opportunities that exist outside of traditional classroom to stimulate alternative models of learning and instruction that bring out the motivations and interests of students in a way that's more directly tied to where their motivation lies and their interpretations of reality. It's going to be really interesting to see with our current coronavirus situation, the different kinds of designs for out of school learning that are going to be erupting, that are kind of be challenging the authority of a classroom. One other thing to note here that's really important, for a lot of questions, and this is a silly way of stating it, just ask Siri. Knowing who to ask, how to ask, and where to get access. Our relationship to knowledge is changing, and it's changing very dramatically in front of us. And schools can't keep up very well, but it's happening 24/7 all the time. And so the way we view expertise itself is changing. And so that is also needs to be considered in how we're thinking about the designs of assessments.
Kristen?
A lot of this is making me thinking that there is a real tension in assessment in that we almost always need to constrain a situation and remove some context in order to see the things we want students to do to make the inferences that we want to make. And on the other hand, what we're talking about, what Richard, you were just saying, is learning happens everywhere, and and that is absolutely the case. But we don't think of assessment happening everywhere. We think of assessment as happening in this more controlled, constrained environment. And in fact, as soon as we start to loosen some of those constraints, it becomes a lot harder to make those inferences because we're not sure why students are doing this or what they're doing. And so even back to the question in the chat about, can we use the moves that learners make to develop their own minds? Maybe, but it's going to be hard to make an inference. Did they make that move for this reason or for that reason? What does that move actually tell us about the learner that we want to know about? And so I think this is something that as a measurement community we need to grapple with, is this: how do we think about inference when we don't have a really, really tightly constrained environment? And how loose can we get with the constraints that we have on the observations that we want to make about learners?
Lloyd, I know you wanted to say something as well.
Well, it was several comments ago, but I don't want our audience to leave with the impression that all thinking is equal and that all answers are equally good. Roman numerals, Arabic numerals aren't just different from Roman numerals, they're better than Roman numerals. So there are some answers that are better than others. If you try to build a bridge on the notion that 2 + 2 is 5, it's going to fall. So we want to make sure that in our, and I'm a great champion of understanding how a kid got to where he is, we still want him to come up with good answers, not just think hard and long about wrong answers. That's my only point.
Yeah. Don't see any other hands. Other members of the panel, did you want to respond? Don't see any hands going up here.
One of my current concerns concerns the extent to which we can use assessment situations to teach as well as to measure. We haven't talked a lot about that. I don't know a lot about it. But as I look over the fence at what's happening in gaming, epistemic games, it does appear that a lot of learning is occurring in those domains. And what do we think about it? Where's that going?
Kristen, I think this is your area.
Ready to embrace it as readily as I am?
I'll take that one too, at least as initial. I think that certainly there's a number of things happening in the game world, and games are all about students learning. And there's people like Val Shute, who's thinking, about stealth assessment. Hey, as they're learning, can we just get some measurements along the way that'll help us, understand what students know and be able to work through there? And therefore we've got, the focus is on the learning, and then we can kind of, assessment comes along with it and where things go. A couple of things that I've found in that world. So one is that assessment isn't going to happen, a good assessment isn't going to happen unless it's designed into the experience. So we can't just say, hey, this is a great learning experience, I'm sure we can get some assessment out of it, or the other way, hey, this is a great assessment, I think we can get some learning stuffed in here. They need to, if we want that to be a goal, we need to design for learning and assessment together and simultaneously as a piece of it. But I think that we can look to some of those new technologies and the fact that we can gather that digital data as a way that we can gather information without saying, wait, stop, you have to take a test now. We can see what students are doing as they're engaged in the process, as they're moving.
We have a question or a comment from Jim Corder. You have the floor.
Okay, sorry, took me a minute to unmute. Well, I just wanted to follow up on Ed's comment or question there. I mean, there's research in cognitive psychology by people looking at learning that, taking periodic tests indeed helps consolidate knowledge. So, I mean, that's one simple way that testing can aid learning. And of course, Richard and others have mentioned cognitively diagnostic testing, which is aimed at constructing tests that focus specifically on what pieces of knowledge or what cognitive skills you have and do not have. And, that field of research, it seems to me, is ideally suited to meshing with education. Although, as Kristen points out, it has to be it's probably best when it's designed that way, when the assessments are developed for the teaching task, or the teaching calls up the test design problem.
The comments from the other members of the panel. Thank you. Yeah.
Jennifer, can I make a comment?
Yes, of course.
One of the things I've learned from reading the Gordon Commission reports, and I encourage people to read them. If you Google Gordon Commission report, you'll get 3 reports. Has to do with the tension between standardization and context. And what I've, a lot of times we think about standardization, or standardization is not necessarily a bad word. 19th century and 20th century standardization is different, right? And standardization in measurement comes from the birth of experimental psychology in Germany, in Wundt and Weber's lab. And there we're trying to make sure that any inference we make comes from our treatment and not from anything else. So in 19th and 20th century standardization, we're trying to come up with an assessment situation that takes context out of the picture so there's a level playing field for everyone.
Mm.
And I think what we've learned in the 21st century is we can't take context out. And I think one of the messages I'm getting from the Gordon report, from these conversations, is we actually want to measure context and include it in the measurement, because context is telling us something about the person, and that's important for the inference that we make. So context might be a narrow word, maybe it's culture, maybe it's curriculum, but having like the assessment system standardized but flexible enough so that people can bring their funds of knowledge and people can tap into the way they've learned the material and their culture will allow us to get a better picture, and that picture won't be contributing to things like the achievement gap.
Yeah. Good point.
Richard?
Yeah, sure. I think this tension and how to think about it. Context is always present, but then trying to understand what context is kind of multi-layered. And I'll state since I don't have to worry about getting tenure or anything. This is all imaginary. This is all imaginary, all socially, psychologically constructed based on concepts that are in our minds about things. And so context, multiple layers of context. Think about the student taking an assessment in a setting, a classroom setting, being presented a task on an assessment delivered by a computer that requires interpretation of the computer imagery about a scenario. The scenario is yet another context woven into the context of taking the assessment on this day and with these social characteristics. And then there's the problem task itself, which conjures up understandings of context of what the student can interpret as being the cultural and social and real world context of the problem world. And then within that also brings up other elements of cultural understandings based on the characteristics of the setting, and there can be other notions of setting that are also arising, and that's our problem, is the fluidity of the human conceptual system. It's so damn virtual that it can make anything believable as anything else, even if it may not be the case.
Thank you. Dr. Bond, I saw your hand go up quickly there.
Just a brief note to say that a point that I made in our prior session. What Dr. Gordon has done with this report is to challenge our profession. And as Bert Green had often pointed out before he died, challenges have a way of invigorating a field. So I think this whole thing will be healthy, and that we'll come up with solutions to all of these tensions and problems. That's my only comment.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are nearing the end of our time here, and I certainly want to be aware of that. I would like for Dr. Gordon to kind of have his last words about this session, or your thoughts. The original name of this session, I believe, was "Can Educational Assessments Be Used to Educate?" And I'd like to end with your thoughts, and then, of course, our NCME president is going to sign us off. Dr. Gordon.
Well, I'm glad Steve's there to backstop. I thought about what I would say to get the conversation going. I didn't think about what I would say to end it. You really caught me a little
I'm sorry.
But as an old preacher, you never turn down the pulpit if it's offered to you. I think psychology in general is at a very interesting stage of its development, and psychometrics in particular. I think the kind of things that brought psychometrics to where we are, the exactitude, the precision, the control of environment, standardizations, all of these things were useful at a time when our understanding of what we were looking for was kind of different from now. I don't pass up the opportunity these days to talk about a book I'm reading but not understanding. It's written by a theoretical physicist, and it's Meeting the Universe Halfway. Durand is her name. And she claims to be writing at a time that physics, theoretical physics in particular, is facing a bit of a crisis. It came into existence at a time when epistemologically, we were convinced of the fixity of things. Things had their place, and you could kind of count on them staying there. It is now facing a reality in which everything is presumably in motion, constantly changing. And instead of finding the place or the relationship, the task is to understand the relationships between things, the changing relationships among things. Psychologist down at Swarthmore talks about relational adjudication, argues that the highest intellective activity these days consists of our trying to adjudicate relationships between these things out there that are changing, where you've got to hold artificially some things in place to understand other things as if the world were static, but the context for those things is very dynamic. Lloyd gives me credit for challenging the field. I hope so, but I don't think I'm doing anything more than pointing to some problems. It is existence itself that is challenging us. What we are trying to measure in human beings is not as consistent as I used to think it was. The Ed Gordon that one talks to today is a very, very different Ed Gordon than the Ed Gordon one might have talked to in 1960. And I've lived long enough to realize that the Ed Gordon you talked to this evening is different from the Ed Gordon you talked to yesterday. Now, how are you going to measure that? I think we need almost 2 or 3 screens. One that is the fixed screen. One is trying to capture whatever's standing still long enough to do it. But the other has got to be sensitive to all the other stuff that's going on there. I think the field of medicine probably is a little bit ahead of us in psychology, where physicians are trying to understand the functioning of my heart, even as it is changing. But she's got to find enough about it to treat me today, even though she recognizes that the pictures that she took of it yesterday may not be today's pictures and won't be tomorrow's pictures, but you got to make some judgments about what's going on there. So what I'm reading is that the psychometrics I learned in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s probably has to open up a bit for a new psychometrics that is more sensitive to change, to dynamics, to context, and even to interpretation, since we are beginning to know that my response to the items on the test depend as much on what Lloyd intended when he wrote them, but also on what I think they mean to me in the light of an experience that Lloyd has never shared. So I don't know what utility there is in my closing remark, except I'm confused. Steve, it's you.
Thanks, gosh, thanks. Thank you all so much for just a wonderful session. I want to first just thank Jennifer. She introduced everybody, but I didn't get to introduce her. She's my colleague, one of my most valuable colleagues at University of Massachusetts, where she's professor of psychometrics and associate dean for academic affairs and associate director for our Center for Educational Assessment. What a masterful job you did, Jennifer. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Edmund and Lloyd and Keena and Kristen and Richard for transforming me from my shelter-in-place existence to, just another world. It was one of the best, academic discussions I've had in a while. Our work is certainly not done, but I think to get 100 or more of us together to talk about where we should be going has really been great. Thank you for giving us a little bit of a conference during this crazy time. I'm just going to end by reminding people what we have coming up. So this is the session today, and then on Monday, if this works, on Monday we have the NCME business meeting where I'll transition the president to Yed, Dr. Tong, and Michael Walker will talk about the awards, and Dr. Reshitar will give us some information about the budget and what our finances look like. So will it be as exciting and as engaging as today? Possibly. But if all goes well, we will reconvene in person to talk about a lot of the issues that Dr. Gordon brought up today and our panelists talked about. So if we could do a big virtual applause for our panelists and Dr. Gordon, thank you so much. And we will see you all on Monday. Thank you. Oh, and we will post this video too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Let's